The crowd erupted into thunderous applause as Muhammad Ali stepped off the stage at Columbia University. It was 1977, and despite his recent defeat to Leon Spinks, Ali remained one of the most recognizable and influential figures in America. Students and faculty had packed the auditorium to hear the former heavyweight champion speak about his career, his opposition to the Vietnam War, and his conversion to Islam. Security guards flanked him as he made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and smiling for photographs. "The greatest of all time," someone shouted from the back. Ali winked and pointed in their direction. "You got that right." As the crowd began to disperse, a woman with intense eyes and a tight-lipped expression pushed her way toward him. She was in her mid-30s, clutching a notebook filled with scribbled notes, her knuckles white from gripping it so hard. There was something different about her, not the usual fan or autograph seeker. The security guards tensed as she approached, but Ali raised his hand slightly, signaling them to stand down. "Mr. Ali," she said, her voice sharp and challenging. "Rebecca Winters from the University Press. I have a question you didn't answer on stage." Ali, always ready for engagement, smiled broadly. "One more question for the greatest? Go ahead, sister." The room hadn't fully emptied, and those still present fell silent, sensing the tension in her voice. Rebecca's eyes narrowed as she looked directly at Ali. "You've experienced racism, discrimination, had your title stripped away, been vilified by the media, and recently lost your championship. You've seen the worst of humanity and suffered immensely for your beliefs." Her voice grew louder with each word. "How can someone as intelligent as you still believe in God? What kind of God would allow a man like you to suffer so much for standing up for what's right?" The remaining audience members gasped. Security stepped forward, but Ali again motioned them back. His smile didn't fade, but his eyes grew serious, focused. The playful showman disappeared, replaced by something deeper, more thoughtful. "That's not just a question," Ali said quietly. "That's your pain talking." He gestured to a pair of empty chairs nearby. "Let's sit down." Rebecca hesitated, surprised by his response. She had expected outrage, dismissal, or at best, a rehearsed religious platitude. Instead, the most famous athlete in the world was inviting her to have a conversation. Reluctantly, she took the seat across from him. "You didn't come here just to ask a question," Ali said, his voice gentle but firm. "You came to make a statement. Something's hurting you deeply." He leaned forward slightly. "Before I answer why I believe, tell me why you don't." The unexpected reversal caught Rebecca off guard. Her prepared follow-up questions scattered from her mind. For a moment, the hard edge in her eyes softened, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "My brother was a freedom rider," she said finally. "He went down south in '61 to fight segregation. They beat him so badly he never walked again. He spent 15 years in pain before he died last year." Her voice cracked slightly. "He was a better person than most, and he suffered his entire adult life while the men who hurt him went free, raised families, lived comfortable lives. Where was God for him?" Ali nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The room around them had grown completely silent. Even the security guards seemed transfixed. "I'm truly sorry about your brother," Ali said. "He sounds like a brave man who fought for justice, just like I try to do. But you didn't answer my question." Rebecca pressed, her defenses rising again. "How can you still believe? After everything you've been through? After being called a traitor to your country? After losing years of your career for standing up against an unjust war? Where was God when they took your title away?" Ali was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his famous bravado was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his words came slowly, thoughtfully. "God was right where he's always been, with me through every moment, every struggle, every injustice." He tapped his chest. "When they called me a traitor, God gave me the strength to stand firm. When they took my title, God reminded me that my worth isn't in a belt. When people hated me, God taught me to love anyway." Rebecca shook her head, unconvinced. "Those are just words. Beautiful words, but still just words." Ali leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Let me ask you something. Do you believe in light?" "What?" The question confused her. "Light," Ali repeated. "Do you believe it exists?" "Of course," she said. "That's not the same thing at all." "But what if you were born blind?" Ali pressed. "What if you'd never seen light your entire life? Would it still exist?" "Yes, but that's different." Light is scientifically proven. We can measure it. Allie nodded. And yet a person born blind has to take that on faith. They have to trust others who say light exists, even though they've never experienced it themselves. He leaned forward again. Faith isn't about ignoring suffering or pretending the world is perfect. It's about seeing beyond the darkness to something greater. Rebecca's expression remained skeptical, but she was listening intently now, her initial hostility softening. "Let me tell you something," Allie continued. "When I refused to step forward for the draft, I knew what would happen. I knew they'd take my title, ban me from boxing, possibly send me to prison. I was at the height of my career, making millions of dollars. I could have compromised, stayed quiet, kept my wealth and fame. But something inside me, something I believe was God, gave me the courage to stand up for what was right no matter the cost." "And you think that justifies all the suffering in the world?" Rebecca challenged, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "No," Allie said simply. "I don't claim to understand all suffering. I don't know why your brother had to endure what he did. But I do know this. Without faith, suffering has no meaning at all. It's just cruelty, without purpose. With faith, even the worst pain can become part of something meaningful, something transformative." As Allie spoke, a small crowd had begun to gather again, drawn by the intensity of their conversation. Among them was an elderly black janitor who had been quietly cleaning in the background. He stood still now, his mop forgotten in his hands, listening to every word. "Let me tell you a story," Allie said. "When I was a boy in Louisville, I got my bicycle stolen. I was crying, mad as can be, and I went to a police officer for help. Know what he told me? He said he'd help me find the bike, but then he also wanted to teach me how to box." Allie smiled at the memory. "That was Joe Martin, the man who started me boxing. If my bike hadn't been stolen that day, I might never have become a boxer, never become champion, never had the platform to stand up for my beliefs." He spread his hands wide. "Now, did God make someone steal my bike? I don't think so. But God can take the bad things that happen and weave them into something beautiful. That stolen bike led me here, talking to you today." Rebecca was silent, processing his words. The skepticism in her eyes remained, but something else was there too. A reluctant curiosity, perhaps even a tiny crack in her certainty. "Faith doesn't mean I never question God," Allie continued. "It doesn't mean I always understand. Sometimes I cry out, ask why things have to be so hard. But then I remember, every struggle has made me stronger, wiser, more compassionate. Every injustice I've faced has given me a deeper commitment to fighting for justice for others." He gestured toward her. "Your brother's suffering was terrible. But look at you. His pain has made you passionate about questioning injustice, about demanding answers. That's powerful. That's how change happens." For the first time, Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But it's not fair," she whispered, her voice suddenly small. "It's not fair that he suffered while others didn't." "You're right," Allie agreed. "It's not fair, and I won't pretend to have all the answers. But I believe your brother's courage matters. I believe his sacrifice matters. In God's eyes and in the arc of history that bends toward justice." The janitor, who had been listening, stepped forward, his voice cracking with emotion. "Excuse me, miss. I don't mean to interrupt, but I was in Alabama in '61 too. I saw what they did to those freedom riders." He clutched his cap in his hands. "Your brother helped change things. My grandchildren can drink from any water fountain, sit anywhere on the bus because of people like him who were brave enough to stand up." Rebecca turned toward the old man, momentarily speechless. "That's the thing about faith," Allie said gently. "It helps us see the bigger picture. Your brother's story didn't end with his suffering. It continues through you, through this man's grandchildren, through everyone who benefits from the changes he fought for." A tear finally escaped and rolled down Rebecca's cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but more followed. Years of tightly controlled anger and grief were beginning to crack. "I miss him," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I miss him so much." "Of course you do," Allie said, reaching out tentatively to pat her hand. "And I believe he knows that, wherever he is now. Faith gives me hope that death isn't the end of our story." The vulnerability in Rebecca's face suddenly gave way to frustration again. "But how do you know? How can you be so sure when there's so much evidence against it?" Allie smiled gently. "Faith isn't about certainty. It's about hope. It's about choosing to believe in something greater than ourselves even when it's difficult." He looked around the room, then back at Rebecca. Look at it this way. If I'm wrong and there is no God, then I've still lived a life of purpose, fighting for justice, trying to make the world better. But if I'm right, if there is a God who cares about human suffering and is working to redeem it, then every struggle has meaning, every sacrifice matters, and one day all things will be made right. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. And that hope, that's what gets me through the darkest nights. Rebecca's hands trembled as she flipped through her notebook, struggling to regain her composure. She had come to this event armed with challenging questions, determined to expose what she saw as the hypocrisy of religion. Instead, she found herself fighting back tears in front of Muhammad Ali and a growing crowd of onlookers. I don't understand how you maintain this optimism, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. You lost nearly 4 years of your career, your prime years as an athlete. Doesn't that make you angry? Don't you ever want to scream at the unfairness of it all? Ali's eyes crinkled at the corners. Oh, I get angry. I'm human. But I've learned something important. Anger can be fuel for change, or it can be a fire that burns you up from the inside. He studied her face. I think you know something about that kind of fire. Rebecca looked away, unable to hold his gaze. The truth of his words stung. When I was banned from boxing, Ali continued, I could have become bitter, turned that anger inward. Instead, I spoke at colleges, met people from all walks of life, deepened my faith, grew as a person. Those 4 years changed me, made me more than just a boxer. An older white professor who had been listening stepped forward. I opposed Ali during the Vietnam years, he admitted. Thought he was wrong, unpatriotic. But watching him stay true to his principles even at great personal cost, it made me question my own beliefs about the war. He looked at Ali with respect. You changed minds, including mine. Ali nodded appreciatively. See, that's what I mean. God takes what looks like defeat and turns it into victory, just not the kind I could have imagined. But what about my brother? Rebecca pressed, her voice catching. What possible good came from his suffering? He was in pain every single day. He never got to have a family, a career, any of the things he dreamed about. Before Ali could answer, a young black student spoke up from the edge of the gathering crowd. Miss, I'm studying law because I read about the Freedom Riders when I was 14. Their courage inspired me. One day I hope to work for the ACLU, fighting for civil rights. He paused, suddenly emotional. What was your brother's name? I'd like to remember him. Rebecca stared at the young man, momentarily speechless. James, she finally said. James Winters. James Winters, the student repeated solemnly. I won't forget. Ali watched the exchange with a gentle smile. Life is like boxing, he said after a moment. It's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. He tapped his chest again. Your brother got hit hard, but from what you've told me, he never gave up his faith in a better world. That's real courage. Rebecca shook her head, still struggling. But why? Why did it have to be him? Why do good people suffer while evil people prosper? How is that part of any divine plan? Those are questions people have been asking since the beginning of time, Ali acknowledged. I don't claim to have perfect answers, but I believe every act of courage, every stand against injustice, sends ripples through the world and through time itself. He gestured to the people gathered around them. Look at how your brother's story is touching people right now, decades later. That's something powerful. A middle-aged woman in a nurse's uniform who had been listening quietly stepped forward. I cared for patients with spinal injuries for 20 years, she said. Some of the bravest, most inspiring people I've ever met. They taught me more about courage and perseverance than anyone. She looked at Rebecca. Your brother's suffering wasn't meaningless. He changed lives just by how he faced each day. Rebecca looked around at the faces watching her. The janitor, the professor, the law student, the nurse, each reflecting back to her a different perspective on suffering and meaning. For the first time, she felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the wall of anger she'd built over the years. I want to believe that, she admitted, her voice small. I want to believe it meant something. Ali's eyes were kind, but intense. Faith isn't something anyone can give you. It's a choice you make especially when it's difficult. He leaned forward. But let me ask you this. What if your brother could see you right now? What would he want for you? Would he want you to stay angry, bitter, closed off from hope? Or would he want something more for his sister? The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Tears welled up again, and this time she didn't try to hide them. "He wouldn't want this," she whispered. "He was always the optimistic one, even after the attack. He never lost his faith, not even at the end." A sob escaped her. "I'm the one who lost faith. I'm the one who got angry at God, at everything." The crowd around them had grown silent, witnessing something raw and personal. Allie reached out and gently took Rebecca's hand. "That anger, it comes from love," he said softly. "You loved your brother so much that seeing him suffer was unbearable. That kind of love is sacred, but anger can only sustain you for so long before it hollows you out." Rebecca's shoulders shook as years of tightly controlled grief finally broke through. "I don't know how to let it go," she admitted through tears. "The anger has been my companion for so long." "It takes courage to open yourself to hope again," Allie said. "Maybe even more courage than it takes to step into a boxing ring." He smiled gently. "But if your brother could keep his faith through everything he endured, maybe that faith was rooted in something real, something worth holding on to." The janitor who had spoken earlier approached and placed a weathered hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Miss, I lost my son in Vietnam. For years I was angry at the world, at God, at everything. Couldn't see the point in going on." His voice was thick with emotion. "But one morning I saw the sun rise, beautiful as anything, and I heard a voice inside me say, 'He sees this too, just from a different shore.' And somehow, I knew it was true." Rebecca looked up at the old man, seeing the peace in his lined face despite the pain he'd carried. "How?" she asked simply. "How did you find your way back to faith?" "One small step at a time," the janitor replied. "By being willing to see beauty again. By letting myself believe that love is stronger than death. By choosing hope over bitterness even when it was the harder choice." Allie nodded in agreement. "That's it exactly. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to trust that there is meaning, even when we can't see it." He looked at Rebecca intently. "Your brother never gave up that trust. Maybe that's something worth holding on to." Rebecca wiped at her tears, suddenly aware of how public this moment had become. Yet strangely, she felt no embarrassment, only a curious lightness, as if something long constricted within her was beginning to breathe again. "I came here to challenge you," she admitted to Allie. "To prove you were naive or deluded for keeping your faith despite everything you've been through." Allie laughed, his eyes crinkling. "And instead we're having a real conversation about the things that matter most." God has a sense of humor like that. For the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of Rebecca's mouth. It was tentative, rusty from disuse, but real. "I still have questions," she said. "So many questions." "Of course you do," Allie replied. "Questions are how we grow. The problem isn't having questions, it's thinking we have to have all the answers before we can have faith." He looked around at the diverse faces surrounding them. Every person here is on their own journey, wrestling with their own doubts and beliefs. That's what makes us human. The law student who had spoken earlier raised his hand tentatively. "Mr. Ali, how do you respond to people who say religion is just a way to comfort ourselves in the face of a meaningless universe?" Ali considered the question thoughtfully. "I'd say they're half right. Faith does provide comfort, but that doesn't make it untrue." He pointed out the window to the campus beyond. "Is a sunset any less beautiful because it comforts us? Is love any less real because it gives us joy? Some of the most profound truths in life are also the ones that heal our hearts." Rebecca was watching Ali now with a different expression, still questioning, still uncertain, but open in a way she hadn't been before. The rigid certainty of her anger had softened into something more complex, more human. "What if I can't believe?" she asked quietly. "What if I've been angry for too long?" "Faith isn't an all-or-nothing proposition," Ali replied gently. "It's a journey. Some days I feel God's presence as clearly as I feel the sun on my face. Other days, I have to trust based on what I've experienced before." He smiled at her. "Maybe start small. Be open to the possibility that your brother's life and suffering had meaning, that his courage mattered, that love doesn't end with death." The nurse who had spoken earlier stepped closer. "After my husband died, I found that grief and faith aren't opposites. They can exist side by side. I could miss him terribly while also believing we'd meet again." Rebecca looked around at the circle of faces, strangers who had somehow become companions on this unexpected journey. The anger that had driven her for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. making room for something else, something that felt surprisingly like hope. "Thank you," she said simply to Allie, her voice quiet but steady, "for not dismissing my questions, for seeing past my anger." Allie's smile was warm. That's what faith teaches us, to look beyond the surface, to see the heart beneath. He glanced at his watch reluctantly. "I'm afraid I need to go soon. I have another engagement." Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of how much time had passed. "Of course. I've taken enough of your time." She began gathering her notes, then paused, looking up at him again. "One last question, if I may." "Of course," Allie said. "What sustains your faith when doubts come, when the suffering seems too great, the injustice too overwhelming?" Allie was quiet for a moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with conviction. "I look at the stars," he said simply, "at the vastness of the universe, at the miracle of each human life." He spread his hands wide. "And I ask myself, is it more reasonable to believe that all of this is random, meaningless chance? Or that there's purpose, design, love at the heart of existence?" His eyes met hers. "For me, faith has always been the more reasonable choice." The sun was setting as Rebecca stepped out of the auditorium, casting long shadows across the Columbia University campus. The crowd had dispersed, students and faculty returning to their routines, but she stood still, feeling strangely untethered. The conversation with Muhammad Ali had left her shaken in ways she hadn't anticipated. She found a bench overlooking the central lawn and sat down, opening her notebook. She had come prepared with pages of challenging questions, arguments, and counterpoints, intellectual weapons honed over years of anger and doubt. Now, looking at her neat handwriting, the words seemed hollow, missing the point somehow. "Excuse me, Miss Winters?" Rebecca looked up to see the janitor who had shared about his son in Vietnam. He stood respectfully a few feet away, still holding his mop. "I don't mean to disturb you," he said, "but I wanted to give you something." He held out a worn, leather-bound book. "It's a journal I kept after my son died. My way of talking to him, and to God. Maybe some of it might speak to you." Rebecca hesitated, then took the journal. "I can't take this. It's too personal." The old man shook his head. "I've made my peace. Don't need it anymore. And something tells me you might find something useful in there." He smiled gently. "Just return it when you're done. I work here every weekday." Before she could protest further, he turned and walked away, his mop swinging rhythmically against the polished floor. Rebecca opened the journal cautiously, feeling like an intruder. The pages were filled with a careful, deliberate handwriting, sometimes steady, sometimes shaky with emotion. Random entries caught her eye. "God, I'm so angry I can barely breathe. Why my boy? Why? Found one of his baseball cards today. Sat on the floor and cried for an hour. Chaplain Jenkins visited. Said grief is love with nowhere to go. Never thought of it that way before. Dreamed of Thomas last night. He was laughing. Woke up with tears on my face, but they weren't all sad tears." Each entry was a raw chronicle of grief, anger, questioning, but as the pages progressed, something else emerged. Moments of peace. Small joys cautiously embraced. Questions that remained unanswered but somehow lost their bitter edge. Rebecca closed the journal, her own eyes wet with tears. She thought about her brother James, about the years she'd spent defending his memory by staying angry, as if letting go of that anger would somehow dishonor his suffering. "Miss Winters?" She looked up to see the young law student who had asked about her brother's name. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said hesitantly, "but I wanted to ask, do you have a photograph of your brother? I meant what I said about remembering him." Rebecca stared at him for a moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Behind her faculty ID was a small worn photograph of James, smiling broadly from his wheelchair, his eyes alight with the determination that even paralysis couldn't extinguish. "This was taken about 5 years after the attack," she said, handing it to the student. "At my graduation." The young man studied the photograph with reverence. "He has kind eyes," he said finally. "Strong, but kind." "Yes," Rebecca said softly. "That's exactly right." The student returned the photo, then hesitated. "Would it be all right if I contacted you sometime? I'd like to learn more about him, about that time, for my studies, but also just because I think it's important to remember." Rebecca felt something shift inside her, a door, long closed, creaking open. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself. I'd like that very much. She watched the student walk away, then turned back to look at James's photograph. For so long, she had focused on the injustice of his suffering, the unfairness of his early death. But looking at his smiling face now, she remembered something else: his unshakable optimism, his ability to find joy despite everything, his faith that had remained intact even as his body failed him. "What would you think of me now, James?" she whispered to the photograph. So angry, so closed off. As if in answer, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees overhead. A memory surfaced. James in his hospital bed after the attack, his broken body held together by casts and stitches, looking up at her with a surprising peace in his eyes. "Don't be angry for me, Becca," he had said. "That's not how I want to live whatever life I have left." But she had been angry, for him, and then increasingly for herself, for the unfairness of a world that took good people like James while leaving monsters untouched. That anger had become her identity, her mission, her wall against further pain. Rebecca stood up, tucking the journal and photograph carefully into her bag. The campus was quieter now, most students gone for the day. She began walking slowly toward the gate, her mind still churning with the day's unexpected conversation. At the campus exit, she almost bumped into a middle-aged woman entering with a small bouquet of flowers. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca apologized, stepping aside. The woman smiled. "No harm done." She noticed Rebecca's red-rimmed eyes. "Are you all right, dear?" Rebecca was about to give her standard deflection when something made her pause. "I'm not sure," she admitted honestly. "I've had a rather extraordinary conversation today." The woman nodded understandingly. "Sometimes those are the ones that change us the most." She held out her hand. "I'm Margaret, by the way." "Rebecca." They shook hands briefly. "Are you visiting someone?" Rebecca asked, nodding toward the flowers. A shadow passed over Margaret's face. "In a manner of speaking. My daughter was a student here. She passed away 2 years ago, leukemia. I come every month on the 15th to leave flowers at her favorite spot on campus." "I'm so sorry," Rebecca said, meaning it deeply. Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. "Thank you. It's still hard, but I'm learning to carry her with me in a different way now." She tilted her head, studying Rebecca. "You look like someone who understands loss." "My brother," Rebecca said simply. "He was paralyzed during the Freedom Rides. Died last year after a long struggle." Margaret reached out and squeezed Rebecca's arm. "Then you know. The hole they leave behind never completely closes." "How do you do it?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "How do you keep going? Keep believing in anything?" Margaret considered the question thoughtfully. "For me, it's about honoring Katie's life by living mine fully. She was so vibrant, so present in every moment. When I retreat into grief or bitterness, I feel like I'm betraying how she lived." She looked down at the flowers in her hand. "And I choose to believe we'll meet again, that this isn't the end of her story, or mine." "Faith?" Rebecca said quietly. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Not always easy faith, not faith without questions or doubts, but faith nonetheless." They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by the universal experience of loss. Then Margaret glanced at her watch. "I should go before it gets dark," she said. "It was nice meeting you, Rebecca." "You too," Rebecca replied. As Margaret turned to go, she added impulsively, "I hope Katie knows about the flowers." Margaret looked back, a peaceful smile on her face. "I believe she does." She nodded once more, then continued through the gate onto the campus. Rebecca watched her go, struck by the quiet dignity in the woman's grief. There was pain there, certainly, but not the consuming bitterness that had taken root in Rebecca's own heart. There was room for joy alongside the sorrow, for hope alongside the loss. She thought again of Muhammad Ali's words earlier that day. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to trust that there is meaning, even when we can't see it. For so long, Rebecca had demanded answers, clear, irrefutable evidence before she would consider opening herself to faith again. But watching Margaret walk away, flowers in hand for a daughter 2 years dead, she wondered if perhaps she had it backward. Maybe faith wasn't the end result of having all your questions answered. Maybe it was the courageous choice to live as if life had meaning, even in the face of suffering and loss. She thought of her brother James, of his unshakable belief that his sacrifice was part of something larger, something meaningful. She thought of Ali, standing firm in his convictions despite losing years of his career. She thought of the old janitor, finding his way back to joy after losing his son. None of them had all the answers. None of them could explain away the reality of suffering or injustice. But each had made a choice to trust, to hope, to believe that there was more to the story than what could be seen on the surface. As Rebecca walked toward the subway station, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She stopped for a moment, really looking at the sunset for what felt like the first time in years. She remembered another of James's sayings: "God paints the sky differently every evening, Becca. Never wastes a canvas." "I miss you, James," she whispered to the sky. "I've been so angry for so long. I don't know if I can find my way back to faith, but maybe I can try to see the world through your eyes again." She felt no dramatic revelation, no sudden lifting of doubt, but as she continued walking, something had changed. A tiny seed of possibility planted where before there had been only barren certainty. The questions remained. The pain was still real, but alongside them was something new, a cautious openness to hope. 2 weeks later, Muhammad Ali was signing autographs after a charity event in Boston when an assistant approached with an envelope. "This came for you, champ," he said. The woman said it was important. Ali took the envelope, noting the Columbia University return address. Inside was a letter and a newspaper clipping. He unfolded the letter first. "Dear Mr. Ali, you likely won't remember me. I was the woman who rather aggressively questioned your faith after your speech at Columbia University. I came looking for an argument that day, but instead found something I didn't know I needed. A conversation that cracked open a door I had long kept shut. I want you to know that our conversation has stayed with me. The questions haven't disappeared, but they've changed somehow. They feel less like weapons and more like companions on a journey I'm just beginning to undertake. I've enclosed a piece I wrote for the university press. It's not a retraction of my questions or doubts, but perhaps a more nuanced exploration of them. You might be interested to know that it has generated more letters to the editor than any article in the past year, from people sharing their own struggles with faith, their own journeys through grief and doubt. I've also been meeting regularly with the janitor who was present during our conversation. Harold is his name. His journal has been an unexpected source of comfort, as has his friendship. And the law student Marcus has been interviewing me about James for a project on the Freedom Riders. Through his questions, I'm remembering parts of my brother I had allowed anger to obscure. I don't know where this path leads. I haven't had any dramatic conversion or revelation, but I find myself open to possibilities I had long since dismissed. I find myself looking at sunsets again, and remembering James's joy in them. I find myself considering that perhaps faith isn't the absence of questions, but the courage to live meaningfully, even without all the answers. Thank you for seeing past my anger to the pain beneath it. Thank you for responding with compassion rather than defensiveness. That conversation was a gift I didn't know I needed. With gratitude, Rebecca Winters. Ali smiled as he finished reading, then turned to the newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Faith in the Face of Suffering. A Skeptic Reconsiders." The byline was, "Rebecca Winters." The article began, 2 weeks ago I confronted Muhammad Ali with what I believed was an unanswerable question. How could someone who had suffered discrimination, vilification, and injustice still believe in a benevolent God? I expected platitudes. What I received instead was an invitation to a deeper conversation about faith, doubt, suffering, and meaning. A conversation that has continued long after that day, both with others and within myself. Ali read the entire piece carefully. It wasn't a declaration of newfound faith. Rebecca's questions and doubts were still evident throughout, but there was also a new openness, a willingness to consider perspectives beyond her own, a tentative reaching toward hope. When he finished reading, Ali folded the article and letter carefully and placed them in his jacket pocket. His assistant, who had been waiting patiently, raised an eyebrow. "Good news, champ?" Ali smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A reminder," he said simply, "that sometimes the most important fights don't happen in the ring." Later that evening in his hotel room, Ali sat down at the desk and pulled out a piece of stationery. He thought for a moment, then began to write. "Dear Rebecca, thank you for your letter and article. Both touched me deeply. Your brother James must have been an extraordinary man to inspire such love and loyalty. Though I never met him, I feel I know something of his spirit through you. You say you're just beginning a journey. That's how faith works. not as a destination we arrive at once and for all, but as a path we walk daily, sometimes stumbling, sometimes striding forward, always growing. The questions you're asking are good ones. Keep asking them. Faith that can't withstand questioning isn't faith worth having, but also be open to mystery, to the possibility that some answers can only be glimpsed through the heart, rather than grasped by the mind. I'm glad you found companions for your journey in Harold and Marcus. We aren't meant to walk alone, and I'm honored to have played some small part in opening a door that had been closed. Whatever path you choose, I believe your brother would be proud of your courage in facing these questions honestly. That kind of intellectual and spiritual bravery is rare and valuable. Remember what I told you. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to trust that there is meaning even when we can't see it. And from your letter, it seems you're discovering that for yourself. Keep looking at those sunsets. Keep asking those questions. Keep your heart open to hope. With respect and admiration, Muhammad Ali. He signed the letter with his characteristic flourish, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. Tomorrow, he would ask his assistant to mail it. For now, he stood and walked to the window of his hotel room, looking out at the night sky scattered with stars. Allah, he whispered, thank you for using me to reach her. May she find the peace her heart is seeking. Ali smiled at the vastness above him. In a career filled with memorable fights and public victories, it was these quieter moments, these one-on-one connections, that often felt the most meaningful. Not every important bout took place with thousands watching. Sometimes the most significant victories happened in conversations no one would ever see, in hearts changed not by his famous fists, but by his willingness to listen, to understand, to share his own journey of faith. As he turned away from the window, Ali felt a deep sense of gratitude. For his gifts in the ring, yes, but even more for the platform those gifts had given him. A platform that allowed him to touch lives like Rebecca's, in ways that transcended boxing, transcended fame, and spoke to the deepest questions of what it means to be human. The greatest, they called him. But in moments like these, he understood that true greatness had little to do with championships or celebrity. It lay in the courage to stand by one's convictions, the wisdom to listen to others' pain, and the faith to believe that every life, every struggle, every question, every moment of connection, mattered in ways we might never fully comprehend. It was enough, more than enough. As Ali prepared for bed, he found himself whispering a prayer of thanks for Rebecca Winters, a woman who had come seeking an argument and instead found the beginning of a journey back to hope.